Everything you know about your life, every sense that you have of the modern, every intuition, every existential doubt, every burst of confusion, every neurotic affirmation or negation was born in the mud and blood of Flanders. For a century, Europe had been at peace even as industrial miracles created wealth and power unlike anything that had ever been known before. The European powers had sliced up the planet like so much confection, and as the boundaries of imperial ambitions tightened like a noose around the neck of civilization, the modern era was born. In a single bullet, fired in the summer of 1914, into the breast of a prince in Sarajevo. That bullet shattered a universe, a realm of certainty, optimism, hope and faith, and in doing so, it sparked the greatest cataclysm in the history of humanity. We sometimes focus on the Second World War as being the great pivotal event of the 20th century, but as Churchill so wisely said, the Second War was but the child of the first. He in fact called it the 30 Years' War, and he said that never was there a war less necessary to fight than the first, or more essential to win than the second. And this really created the essential backdrop of the 20th century, the fulcrum upon which modernity turned, and that really is the backdrop of the story that I'll share with you tonight. Now, the genesis of this tale really began in the fateful spring of 1996 when I traveled 4,000 miles across Tibet from Chengdu in western China to Lhasa on to Kathmandu in that terrible May when the debacle happened on Everest that John Krakauer so powerfully wrote about in his book, Into Thin Air. And with me on that journey was a remarkable friend, Dan Taylor, who was the son and grandson of medical missionaries in the Himalaya. His father had been a great friend of Howard Somerville, who was Mallory's closest friend of the mountain in 1922 and 1924. And the commercialization of Everest today was of great concern to Daniel because this was not the mountain of his imaginings. He had been nursed on stories of Mallory and Somerville and all those other extraordinary men. And by chance, the very next fall, Daniel and I returned to the environs of Everest to try to photograph snow leopards at the base of the Kanchung face and clouded leopards further down the Yunnan Valley. And we got caught in unusual snow conditions. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to tell me tales of these Englishmen in tweeds who flung themselves against the ice and read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 23,000 feet. And I was immediately captivated. And of course, you know the fundamental story. The British, having lost the race for the North and South Poles, focused on Everest as a third pole. It soared above the horizon of the Raj. And famously in 1921, they set out to find the mountain, to walk 400 miles off the map, to come to close quarters with a mountain that no European had approached. And of course, in 1922, they returned in an attempt to climb it. And famously in 1924, on June 8th, George Mallory, 37, the most illustrious climber in the British Empire, and his young protege, Sandy Irvine, a boy of but 22, were last seen by Noah Odell cresting the northeast summit, going strong for the top when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And the question has always been for mountaineers, did they get to the top before they succumbed? But I was never from the very start interested in that story. I wanted to know who these men were. And I knew from their age and their class that invariably they had faced the agony of the Western Front. And my sense was not that they were cavalier about death, but they would have seen so much of death that death had no mystery for them. It had nothing more to teach them save that of their own. And they were prepared to accept a level of risk that would have been unimaginable before the war, the very level of risk that Everest demanded. And so I set out from the very start to trace the lives of the 26 men who went to Everest on those 3 extraordinary expeditions. And I wanted to find out where each man was every single day of the Great War. Now, you may think of that as being a difficult task, and it was famously said, of course, of the Battle of both Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. But if that was true, they kept records about just about everything else. In fact, that war was so thoroughly chronicled that it's a wonder that men found time to fight. And because in the wake of the war, there was a tsunami of publications. And because the actual zone of operations was remarkably small, never larger than the English county of Lincolnshire, the British front was never longer than 125 miles. For much of the war, it was 85 miles long. Behind that front, the British forces built 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad, and the salient around the old medieval cloth hall of Ypres, an area of land that a man could walk around in a long day or two. 1.7 million boys would meet their end. And because the zone of operations was so small, and because there was this tsunami of literature that poured out a decade after the war, there was literally no point in that battle zone that hadn't been chronicled in multiple voices at every single instant of the great campaign. In the voices of shattered subaltern, broken in shell shock, or the bombastic boasts of a Yorkshire sergeant. And because of that, it was possible not only to find out where each man had been every single day of the war, but to ascertain with a level of specificity that I would have thought impossible at the beginning of the project, I was able to ascertain what each man had indeed been exposed to. Now this journey, which was a journey of 12 years that took me to 60 major archives in Europe and North America, was itself in some sense, to quote Siegfried Sassoon in his reference to shell shock, a twilight journey through a memory of hell. At the outbreak of World War I, you had to stand 5'8" to get admission into the British Army. Within 2 months, men 5'3" were eagerly sought. Cremation was unknown before the Great War. In the wake of the war, it became the preferred form of burial for countless thousands of men who had lived 4 years and 4 months with the scent of death, the presence of cadavers in the frontage of the trenches. Plastic surgery was born of the war and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who for the rest of their lives would live behind plastic masks and attend these special holiday camps where they could remove the masks and feel the wind on their gargoyle features without fear of humiliation or shame. The Royal Army Medical Corps would require 108 million battle dressings as well as 22,386 artificial eyes. The regular British Army in the Empire required 2,500 shovels. In the mud of Flanders, 10 million would be required. 25,000 coal miners spent the entire war underground, digging beneath the enemy lines to detonate great charges of TNT that reverberated with percussion that could be felt at Hampstead Heath in London. At Waterloo, both sides, Napoleon and Wellington, discharged 20,000 cannon shots over the course of a 3-day battle. In the Great War, it was not unusual for each side to exchange, in a casual day of combat, 1 million artillery shells. The sound was palpable, as indeed was the smell constantly of rotten flesh. You hear and think of bayonet wounds as being the great iconic symbol of the war. Bayonet wounds accounted for less than 0.5% of morbidity in the Great War. 35% of the soldiers were cut down by machine gun fire or rifle fire, but 65% simply met their end, clinging to fear to the mud of a trench as a rain of fire and steel fell upon them from above. Each month, the British Army required 10,000 junior officers just to replace the boys who died in the trenches. Now think about that. In the entire history of the Afghan-Iraq wars of the last decade, the Americans haven't lost 10,000 men. They would lose that in the Great War, just junior officers every month. And so entire schools like Charterhouse, and where Mallory taught, and Winchester, where he went to school, Marlborough, Eton, Harrow, would literally graduate their senior classes not to Oxford or Cambridge, but directly to the Western Front. By the end of the war, there were nearly 1 million dead in Britain alone, 2.5 million wounded, 40,000 amputees, 60,000 men without sight, 65,000 men who would never recover from the ravages of shell shock. The economic agonies were such that in the first year of the war, more land would exchange hands in Britain than had exchanged hands since the Norman conquest. Women poetically and tragically spoke of the war through the metaphor of dance. Diana Cooper famously remarked that by the end of 1916, every boy I'd ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said, there was no one left to dance with. The poet Stephen Spender said that in the wake of the war, the British middle class continued to dance unaware that the dance floor had simply fallen out from beneath them. So if the quest for Mount Everest began before the war as a kind of a grand imperial gesture, a gesture of redemption for an empire of explorers who had famously lost the races to the North and South Poles, in the wake of the war, it became a mission of regeneration for a people bled white by conflict. Of the 26 climbers that went on those 3 expeditions, walking 400 miles off the map to find the mountain, 20 saw the worst of the fighting. 6 escaped the war, either too old, too young. 1 was a diplomat, 1 a schoolmaster. But 20 most assuredly saw the worst of the fighting. Jack Hazard, who scaled the North Col in 1924, did so with open bleeding wounds from the Somme, saturating the climbing tunic of his gear. 6 were severely wounded. 2 nearly died of disease at the front. John Noel, the legendary photographer, went to his death without acknowledging that he spent most of the war not in combat, as he always said, but shivering in fear in an asylum, suffering from shell shock. 2 lost brothers, Odell and Norton, killed in action, one by errant French fire, and all of them had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the bones and barbed wire, the white faces of the dead. In August of 1917, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who was the best climber of his generation and the mentor of Mallory, recorded in his diary a list of good friends who had perished, 25. This left room for his acquaintances who had been slaughtered, another 25. Young had been at Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, when only the heroic defense of the 1st Canadian Division kept the Germans from breaking the Allied line. And this was a day when the Germans attacked for the first time using poison gas. This is what Young wrote in his journal. This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth lying on the floor and out in the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind by the hideous concentration camps in later Germany, ever quite rekindled. For then, we still thought all men were human. Well, Geoffrey Winthrop Young was the mentor of Mallory, and on the very day that Mallory and Irvine disappeared on Everest, he joined another party of climbers on a more modest summit in the British Empire, the Great Gable, the most beautiful of the peaks of the Lake District. With him was Arthur Wakefield, who had been the physician in 1922 on Everest, and they were there to climb up to the top of the Great Gable to dedicate a plaque to those members of the Fell Rock Climbing Club who had perished in the war. Young struggled up the slopes, supported by his wife, the bitter winds and clouds and rains sweeping the cape off his back as he struggled up the slope, his first climb since losing his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front. He came forward with Wakefield, and Wakefield moved forward and began to move a Union Jack off the plaque, a Union Jack that had been on the battleship Barnum at the Battle of Jutland. And it was said by witnesses that Wakefield began to speak of the breath of the Moor, the spirit of self-sacrifice that had led them all off to, even at the risk, as he put it, of their own self-obliteration, to fight for king and country. And then, according to all ocular witnesses, Arthur Wakefield began to wail, great cries of grief that were heard across all the peaks of the Lake District. And then he stopped. And never again did he express human emotion. Never again would his children see the inside of the church in his presence, even though he began the war as a medical missionary in Newfoundland, attached to the Grenville mission. I became fascinated to know what had become of Wakefield during the war. Well, it turned out that he was a wealthy individual. He had personally armed the legendary First 500 of the Newfoundland Regiment. He had sailed for them at the outbreak of hostilities with the Canadian Army, destined for Salisbury Plain. And then as the boys of Newfoundland peeled off to fight in Gallipoli, he went to France and became a surgeon in the casualty clearing station. Now, these were the field hospitals located just outside of artillery fire, just behind the front. These were places of triage because in battles that often saw morbidity and mortality rates of 75, 80%, each battalion of 1,200 men only had 16 stretcher parties, 16 stretcher parties to evacuate such fields of battle. So if you did get wounded, you crawled through the muck and the cadavers back to what remained of your trench, hoping that some of your mates might carry you back to a casualty clearing station. Then you went through a process of triage. If you were destined to die, a red cross was placed on your forehead and you were put in the moribund ward. If you could walk, crawl, or be carried, you were put onto the hospital trains that carried you to the hospitals on the French coast and eventually to Victoria Station in London through what was known as the Gate of No Return. The attention of the surgeons at the casualty clearing station, 8 surgeons, 2 working to a 6-hour shift, focused on those who would die if they did not receive complete medical attention. The pressure on these men cannot be believed. Geoffrey Keenes, George Mallory's closest friend, was famously operating in the dungeon on the mutilated genitalia of a private when he wiped his brow and he looked up to see King George V at his side. He completely ignored his sovereign and went back to his work. Well, I was able to ascertain that Wakefield had been at the front attached to the 29th Division, and what I wanted to know is whether or not by chance he treated any of his boys of his beloved regiment. His records disappeared from the archives, they were simply gone, but a letter to his wife described an architectural feature that allowed me to know that in May of 1916 he was in Albert, the staging ground of the Somme, and they weren't moving surgeons out of the Somme battlefront a month before the greatest cataclysm in the history of British arms. And I was later able to ascertain that the beloved boys of Newfoundland, remember he was one of 2 doctors in Labrador, so he had literally brought into the world these boys, were attached to the 29th Division, which by complete chance fought at Beaumont Hamel, and it was his casualty clearing station that was waiting for them to return on that fateful day of July 1st. Wakefield had been told, as Somerville at an adjacent casualty clearing station, Howard Somerville had been told to expect perhaps 1,000 casualties in the first week of the battle. In the first day alone, the 4th Army lost 57,000 wounded, no mention of the 35,000 dead. Wakefield, the extent of the debacle wasn't clear to Wakefield, and in the days after the battle, he went through the seas of wounded, trying to hear the lilt of the Newfoundland accent, try to see anybody who had the blue puttees unique to the regiment, the crest of the caribou in gold leaf that was unique to those boys of Newfoundland. And of course, the answer is he couldn't find any. It was as if the entire regiment had simply disappeared, and it had. Because at 9:15 on July 1st, they were ordered to attack Beaumont Hamel, the second wave. Their flank hung in the air because the first Essex hadn't been able to reach the line by the sheer volumes of dead. Shells landed on corpses and flying fragments and flesh blinded the living. Men enveloped in flames went mad and fought each other as they died. When finally the boys went over the top, they were ripped apart on the parapet. A handful reached the German line, only to discover to their horror that the wire had not been cut whatsoever. And indeed, the last thought of many of these brave men, breathless with exhaustion, blood-whipped and deranged with fear, was a horrid realization that the German line was unscathed. Nothing had been damaged, and so in fury they spun into the wire, tossing grenades, their screams baffled by the throaty gurgle men's sound when hit in the brain. Altogether, 810 men of the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top that day. 35 survived the attack. Every officer was lost. Only the commander survived to hear the praise of the British General Staff, who told the Prime Minister of Newfoundland that it was a magnificent display of trained valor. Its assault only failed of success because dead men can advance no further. That was the moment when Arthur Wakefield lost his faith. Now, Howard Somerville, Mallory's closest friend, was also a surgeon at the Somme. You'll recall that on that horrible day, he walked out onto the field of the casualty clearing station to find himself and one other doctor surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys, stacked up, as one remarked, like cordwood. He said it was the most dreadful sight he had ever seen. He, of course, would never come back from Everest. He devoted his life as a medical missionary to saving the living, that it might wipe away all memories of the dead. Geoffrey Winthrop Young used to gather all the poets and and climbers at a wonderful place called Pennypass in Wales, where by day they would climb the crags, and by night they would recite poetry and debate and argue the possibilities of a century of hope that would die in the upcoming war. Of the beautiful boys that he photographed and kept in his photo album, which he called the Pennypass Diary, no fewer than 23 of the climbers would die, 11 be so severely wounded that, like him, they would have to struggle even to walk. Here you see George Mallory on the right, the greatest rock climber besides Mallory in Britain, Siegfried Hereford, to your left, wiped out, of course, Ypres. It was a rather laconic Tom Longstaff, a legendary Himalayan climber, who first told the Everest Committee, as efforts came together to climb the mountain in the wake of the war, as he put it, the supply of young climbers is not what it was before the war. And so if the war informed and haunted the lives of the men, the expeditions themselves were not, as they've often been depicted, isolated adventures removed from the realities of geopolitical life in the Raj. You know, the Raj was a fascinating phenomenon. What held it together? There were, at no point in India were there more than 1,300 British individuals attached to the Indian civil service. Lord Curzon famously remarked that there wasn't a native Indian in the Indian civil service because in the entire subcontinent, a fifth of humanity, there wasn't one man up for the job. Mercantile zeal, severe military reprisals, the co-option of local elites contributed to the power of the Raj, but what really held it together was the sheer audacity of the effort, the sheer gall of a small island nation that never set out to rule the world, but did so with such flair. And the British had indeed transformed the face of India, but at the same time, India itself was a British invention, an imagined place that was woven into reality by the mathematicians and the surveyors and map makers of the Survey of India. Maps were the very key to the notion of India. They codified the features of a subcontinent even as they created the rationale for occupation. So it shouldn't surprise us that the greatest scientific experiment of the 19th century, an experiment that led to the discovery of the mountain we now know as Everest, was the literal measurement of India. At the time, geographers knew that the Earth was not a perfect sphere, but the degree of the distortion was uncertain, and it was of critical interest in navigation. So beginning in 1804, the British set out to literally measure a single arc of longitude across the entire length of the subcontinent of India. To do so, they carried the most sophisticated scientific instrument of the 19th century, these 1,000-pound brass theodolites, and they had to carry them literally the length of India, doing a series of triangulations as they measured a single arc of the meridian. And when they reached the Himalaya, they branched out laterally. And such was the wizardry of mathematics and differential calculus that they could literally look across the skyline of the Himalaya and measure the heights of the distant white peaks that scored the horizon. And incredibly, the estimate of the height of Everest, calculated with pencil and mathematics in 1856, turned out to be but 28 feet off what we now know the height to be through modern GPS technology. And so the discovery of Everest was one thing, but what really haunted the British was what lay beyond the Himalaya, because for over 50 years they'd been involved in a great saga with the Russians. As the British Empire moved across the seas, the Russian Empire moved across the land, expanding at a rate of 55 square miles a day every day throughout the 19th century, bringing the Russians to the very gates of the Raj. This great rivalry, known to the British as the Great Game, to the Russians as the Tournament of Shadows, had brought both countries to the brink of war many times. And what really frustrated Lord Curzon and the British in India is that they had no idea what was really going on north of the Himalaya. The capital of the Tibetan nation was but 250 miles from Darjeeling, a hamlet that sent tea to every village in England, and yet Lord Curzon, as viceroy, could not communicate with the Dalai Lama. He sent a remarkable adventurer by the name of Francis Younghusband on a mission to try to treat with the Tibetans. He was rebuked. And so in 1904, fatefully, Younghusband led a British army that swept away the Tibetan foe, marched on Lhasa, and in doing so created the turmoil that the Tibetans live with to this day. And as they broke the virginity of this mystical capital of Lhasa, and as they retreated, as the winter snows battered their regiments, young husband had to shift from the glory of Lhasa to find another place of imperial desire. And of course, for him, it was no question what that would be, and that was Mount Everest. And so he dispatched Colonel Ryder, along with a man called Rawlings and the legendary spy F.M. Bailey, to survey the Brahmaputra and get as close to Everest as they possibly could, even as he took the bulk of his force out of Tibet. The British invasion only accomplished two things: it destroyed the Tibetan army and awakened the wrath of China. So the Dalai Lama, who had fled to Mongolia with the invasion of the British, soon in 1909 was fleeing the wrath of the Chinese butchers as he moved back into Darjeeling, into the arms of this remarkable diplomat, Charles Bell. Now, Charles Bell was the first true Tibetan scholar, and never again would he allow what happened in 1905, which was a repudiation of the young husband expedition and the isolation of Tibet as the British, in an opportunistic way, fearful of the Russians, made deals with the Chinese. And so he would not let the British into Tibet until certain conditions had been satisfied. Remember, at this time, Nepal is completely closed off. The only way you can get to Everest is through Tibet. And it was only in 1921 when finally the arms deal that Bell had worked for so passionately came together. A shipment of Maxim machine guns, artillery, Lee Enfield rifles, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition to Lhasa. That's when the Dalai Lama agreed that the British could have a go at Mount Everest. And of course, plans to climb the mountain had been around since well before the war. But the war, of course, changed everything. And it was only in March 10th of 1919 that John Noel was brought to speak to a joint assembly of the Alpine Club and the Royal Geographical Society. John Noel, who had in 1913 in disguise gone into Tibet and gotten very close to the mountain, he was the one who had suffered severely shell shock throughout the war. And he was brought to this gathering by young husband to try to prompt interest in this adventure. So he came to the podium, and the first thing he did is he raised his glass to the late Cecil Rawling, who had led that expedition that had reached so close to Everest at the behest of young husband, because everybody in the audience knew what had become of Rawlings. He had fought at every engagement in the war, but he had died at Passchendaele, the maddest battle of a mad war. In 3 months at Passchendaele, the British lost 400,000 men to advance the line 5 miles. At Passchendaele, 90,000 British boys were recovered too mutilated to be identified. 42,000 simply evaporated without a trace, including Cecil Rawlings. And so as John Noel looked out over the assembly, his eyes fell on those still dressed in khaki, because he knew what they had all endured. So as Longstaff said, the supply of climbers was not what it was before the war. So who would go to Everest? Well, of course, George Mallory was certain to be one. But the man who matched him in skill was not an Englishman, it was an Australian by the name of George Finch. George Finch was to ice and snow what Mallory was to rock. You see Finch here on the right of the photograph. And one of the greatest mysteries in the early sagas of Everest in 1921 is why George Finch, who had been already publicly announced as a member of the expedition, was cut from the team not 2 weeks before he was scheduled to sail with George Mallory. At the very last minute, they insisted that both men endure a medical examination by Harley Street doctors. George Mallory passed in fine colors. George Finch failed. But the problem is, not a week later, still thinking that he was attached to the team, he went up to the decompression chambers at Oxford and set world records for endurance. The summer when he had been shut out from the expedition, he went to the Alps and set records on a number of peaks. And so the question came, did they kick him off simply because he was not British? But for that to have occurred, it would have had to involve the duplicity of Sandy Williston, the team naturalist, and Williston was a man incapable of deceit. So the question was, what was going on? Well, I had a look at the medical examinations. It was very clear that they were superficial. There was no sign of pathology. All the doctors seemed to be saying is that his complexion was sallow, his nutrition was poor, his general appearance tired. He basically looked like hell. Well, as it turns out, events in George Finch's personal life had taken a tangled turn that would have unnerved the strongest of men. Sometimes when you do this kind of research, you go to the National Archives, but the really juicy stuff you find in the divorce court records in High Holborn Street. The story all began in the spring of 1915 at an officers' dance when Finch met and soon married Betty Fisher, a 22-year-old aspiring actress, dangerously pretty, and they had nothing in common save the moment, but that was enough. They eloped, leaving their return address as no man's land. He left for France. Betty promised her fidelity, a fidelity that we now know lasted for about a fortnight. He received word in the early months of 1917 that his wife was dying in London. He secured compassionate leave, came back to London, found out that not only was Betty not sick, she was very healthy and the mother of a child that clearly was not of his blood. So he went off to France, thrashed the cuckold to the point of his death, and then returned, and she pledged once again her fidelity. He went back to Salonika, where he was fighting, and had her watched. And for about 3 months, everything was fine, but then things fell apart. But at this point, he didn't really care, because he had fallen in love with a nurse by the name of Gladys May. So as soon as possible, he returns to London to sever his ties with Betty, and his divorce comes through on September 29th of 1920, and 5 weeks later, he marries Gladys May, who is in fact pregnant with his own child. But the problem now is he no longer loves Gladys May. He's fallen in love with Agnes Bubbles Johnson. So now he's done the honorable thing. He's married Gladys May, but now he wants nothing to do with her. But she's not going to be let go so easily. So she takes him to court. And on March 2nd, 1921, a judge orders Finch to return to his home and render his conjugal duties to Gladys May. He has no interest in doing this whatsoever, so he sets out to create, as gentlemen of the era did, a situation that would leave her with no choice but to endure public humiliation or to grant him his freedom. And so he arranges to commit very public adultery with a series of prostitutes on March 15th, 16th, and 17th in room 477 of the Strand Hotel. As intended, this leaves Gladys May with no option, so he is now free to marry the love of his life, Agnes Bubbles Johnson, and his second wife, Gladys May, is literally expunged from the historical record and not even mentioned by Scott Russell in his biographical essay at the beginning of Finch's well-known book, The Making of a Mountaineer. Now, it's not clear how much of this was known to the Everest Committee, but in the rarefied realm of London, the scent of scandal must have been in the air, but this is what we do know. On March 17th, 1921, the very day George Finch was examined by the Harley Street doctors, he had a number of things on his mind. 2 weeks previously, he had been ordered to return to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to his child. Out of the first disastrous relationship, he had inherited responsibility for a 4-year-old boy who bore his name but was not of his blood, a lad who would go on to be the great English actor Peter Finch. To get rid of the second wife, he had promised her £100 for the rest of her life, not insignificant sum for a man who had lost all his family money in the collapse of the Siberian Railroad. And on the very day of the medical examination, he was about to commit adultery with several prostitutes at the Strand Hotel. So it's no wonder, as I write in the book, that he had lost his appetite, and that as the doctors reported, quote, his complexion was sallow, his general appearance tired, his condition poor. So who were the actual men who went to Everest in 1921? Well, here you can see them with the governor of Bengal on the left, Sandy Williston, George Mallory in the pith helmet, Guy Bullock with the pipe, the governor of Bengal, Howard Burry, and then the irascible Scot, Harold Rayburn. They look like a rather mousy bunch, don't they, to be assaulting Everest? Well, let me tell you how mousy they were. Let's start with Sandy Williston. He was a physician, a doctor, and a naturalist. At one point, he responded to an advertisement in the London Times looking for a naturalist to join an expedition to the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda. He, in 24 hours, jumped on transport. It took him 3 months to catch up with the expedition. He spent 9 months in the jungle in the Ruwenzori. And when it came time to go back to London, why would you go the same way? So he walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man since Stanley to do it. Then he thought, well, what about New Guinea? So as Englishmen did in those days, he sailed for New Guinea, stopped by Java, bought 60 convicts, recruited 40 Javanese soldiers, 220 Dayaks from Borneo, and scores of East Indian porters for this big expedition that marched into the jungle of New Guinea and completely and totally died. The last scene in his journal is a lunatic scene where there's only one other white guy alive, and they're having dinner. There's a guy sort of dying on a cot, and the river is literally rising above them as they're sitting with their silverware. And as he notes in his journal, he says, well, at least the good news was it wasn't too hard to wash our dishes, you know. Now, if we go over to my favorite character from 21 is Colonel Howard Burry. Howard Burry in 1905 stained his skin with walnut juice and slipped into forbidden Tibet. He crossed the passes to Kailash. He traveled to Pamirs and Turkestan, always drawn to the sacred. He read the works of Krishnamurti, Kahil Gibran. He studied with the temple priests in China, the priests, the monks of Angkor Wat, the mystics in Tibet. In India, he embarked naked with scented oils on his body down the Ganga, where he became famous for killing a man-eating tiger that had run off and eaten 21 holy men. In time, Howard Burry would become a master fluent in no fewer than 27 Asiatic and European languages. On the eve of the war, he was traveling through the mountains of heaven. He befriended and took on his saddle a little Asiatic bear that he named Agu. As Asiatic bears tend to do, that he got very big. And Howard Burry's favorite form of exercise at his estate at Belvedere in Ireland was to strip himself naked and wrestle under the willow arbor with Agu. He was a soldier, but he was more of a poet. But when the war came, of course, he fought. And he fought through every single engagement, and only once did he nearly go mad. At Devil's Wood, at the Somme front, where that day 4,000 British boys had died. That night, he and his command were ordered to dig a communication trench to the redoubt of Devil's Wood. He began to dig in the darkness and the rain, and he thought he would be digging through the chalk soils of Picardy, and they quickly realized they were digging through 6 feet of corpses of dead. He nearly went mad. And then, when they approached Tingri on the approach march in 21, a moment of redemption came his way. He saw a figure in the horizon who seemed to be standing and falling with the regularity of a metronome. As he came closer, he realized it was a Mongolian Buddhist pilgrim moving one body length at a time in ritual prostration from Lhasa to Kathmandu. And as he clip-clopped by him on the road, he could hear the sound of the hands in the dirt. And for him, it was a stunning affirmation of religious possibility. And he suddenly looked to the south. And for the first time on the entire expedition, he saw the skyline scored by the peak of Everest. So in the initial attempt in 1921, it was less an attempt on the mountain than, of course, a reconnaissance. And they followed the route of the Young Husband expedition invasion of 1904 from Darjeeling up across the Jalapla Pass through this narrow tongue of Tibet that comes down between Sikkim and Bhutan, up the Chumbi Valley to Ferryzong, and eventually leaving the trunk road that goes on to Gyantse and Lhasa, they headed off west, walking off the map in this great arc that would eventually take them through Shegarzong and to what became their headquarters at Tingri-Zong. And their mission, of course, in 1921 was a geographical one as opposed to a mountaineering one. They were trying to map blank spots on the map. They were collecting specimens. They were carrying huge amounts of scientific equipment. They were geologists. They were botanists. And of course, their goal was ultimately to find a chink in the armor that could be exploited the subsequent year when the plan was to actually assault the mountain itself. Now, on this approach march, a very curious thing happened. Arthur Kellis, high-altitude physiologist, 56 years old, too old for Everest, literally died of exhaustion and was buried in the shadow of this fortress on the Tibetan plateau, a fortress known as Kampazong. He was buried, here's his grave, in the site of the 3 great peaks that he had been the first to climb. But a curious thing happened. And one of the great breakthroughs I had in this research was the day that I first went to meet the son of this man, Oliver Wheeler. John Wheeler had had an illustrious career in the Geological Survey. Oliver Wheeler himself, his father Arthur, of course, created the Alpine Club of Canada. Oliver Wheeler had been seconded to the Everest expedition by the Survey of India with the mission of using a new photographic topographical survey technique pioneered in the Rockies by his father to map the inner massif of the mountain. It would be Wheeler who would spend more time higher on the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain, alone on the mountain, than any of the Brits in 1921. And it was Oliver Wheeler, not George Mallory, who found the doorway to the mountain, the route up the East Rongbuk Glacier to the base of the North Col. Now, Mallory famously hated Canadians. I don't know how you hate a Canadian, and I never held that against Mallory much. But Wheeler became my hero because all the British historians will tell you that in 1921, only Guy Bullock kept a journal, a curt thing published by the Alpine Club in 1962. They talk of Mallory's journal. He wrote letters to his beloved wife, Ruth. But when I went to see John Wheeler, it turns out that he lived 5 doors from the house I was born in Vancouver. We had a lovely afternoon, at the end of which he pulled 2 treasures from his shelf, 2 thick journals kept by his father in 1921 as he marched across Tibet with Everest, never seen by a historian. On the day that Kellis is buried, Wheeler's entire journal entry reads thus: "Well, they buried the old boy in the morning. Thought it was going to be the afternoon. Terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. Well, how on earth do you miss the interment of one of the 6 men you're walking across Tibet with? I knew there had to be an answer, and I knew the answer would lie on the Western Front." Wheeler was a soldier. He graduated top of his class from RMC. He won the coveted Sword of Honor. He was attached as a Royal Engineer to the 7th Mer Division at the outbreak of hostilities. He sailed from Karachi with the first troop ships of the Indian Army. Now, by this point in time, the topography of Armageddon had come into place. The trench lines reached from Switzerland to the English coast. Both sides had begun to sap each other. By this point, the British Expeditionary Force had been annihilated. The entire Allied line, the British sector of it, was held by the Canadians in the north and the Indian Army in the south. It came to the attention of Wheeler's command that the Germans had put 2 saps within 30 feet of their front line. He was ordered to go over the top on November 14th, 1914, with 125 men, bury those saps, and to do so in a way that would dissuade the Germans ever doing that again. They go over the top. All hell breaks loose. They discover that the saps are full of Germans about to attack them. The result is a melee of hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, the Indians push the Germans back, but not before the sap is lined 3 bodies deep, chest to chest, of dying boys of both sides, flailing about, as Wheeler would report, like trout in my Creole. He got as many of them out as he could, but in the chaos of battle, he buried many of them alive. So when he says on Everest, "I do hate funerals," you begin to sense the way that the war reverberated in the lives of these men. They never spoke about it. It was never forgotten. Robert Graves and T.E. Lawrence famously made a deal never to speak about it, but it was the backdrop of their lives. And so the effort then to actually explore the mountain really took two major aims in 1923, really. First of all, Wheeler was sent up to the Nangpala to search out reaches to the mountain from the west. Eventually, the team would come over to the east to Karta and assault it through the Karta Chu and up the Gama Chu to the Kanchung Face. And Mallory and Bullock went immediately on a beeline for the Rongbuk Valley because in Tingri they had learned of the existence of a monastery at Rongbuk that was led by a charismatic lama by the man of Zatul Rinpoche, or Narung Tenzin Norbu. Well, here you see the 1921 team somewhat more rough and ready in the mountain. Now, there's a lot of hippie ethnography about Everest. One of the things you hear is that the Rongbuk Monastery has been there since time immemorial. Well, of course, the truth is it was built in the first decade of the 20th century by a charismatic lama who was able to cadge money from all the wealthy Sherpa agriculturalists who had benefited from the British introduction of the potato into Solukhumbu in the 1870s. The valley itself, however, resonated with mystical significance because this was one of the hidden valleys of Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, who disseminated the Dharma to Tibet at the behest of Shakyamuni Buddha in the 9th century. And in doing so, Guru Rinpoche literally created these hidden valleys from which we get the notion of Shangri-La, where he sowed treasures with maps that existed both in literal and metaphysical space. And so Rongbuk itself had no significant history, but the entire time the British were walking in the environs of Everest, they were walking through mystic space. Everest itself has no particular significance as a sacred mountain. It is simply one mountain of many. But this man was very interesting, Zatra Rinpoche, and it was he who the British met famously in 1922. In 21, he was in retreat for the year. But no one's had really ever told the story from the Tibetan side. So one of the things that I did is all abbots write a spiritual autobiography called a Namtar. I got hold of the copy of his Namtar and had it translated by monks in Kathmandu. I also went and lived for months in the monastery in Nepal that was created by his spiritual heir, Tulsi Rinpoche, because to be in that monastery was literally to be in Rongbuk in 1921, because the cycle of liturgical rituals does not vary from year to year. So in 1921 then, the British, having been frustrated on the eastern slope, on the western approaches, having been stymied in the Rongbuk Valley itself, moved around, and here you see a photograph taken by at Petanringbo, a camp at the base of the Kanchung Face, where you're standing on ground higher than anything in North America, looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice. But the Kanchung Face was formidable, and this was not the route that they would take. They followed the Karta Valley up finally to a place that they called Windy Gap, a high pass that allowed them at last to look down over the col of their desires. Now at this point, Wheeler had sent a sketch map to Howard Burry, clearly outlining that the way to get to the North Col was the East Rongbuk Glacier. Mallory refused to give credence to this, and in a letter to his wife, he lied not once but twice about the nature of this route to the mountain. But at the same time, even though he had disdained Wheeler for the entire expedition, when push came to shove, and he was going to cross the head of that East Rongbuk Glacier and assault the North Col to go higher than any man had ever gone in history, who does he take with him? Guy Bullock and Oliver Wheeler. And as they crested the summit of the North Col, they were met with a wind unlike anything they said human beings had ever experienced. It shattered their senses, and as Wheeler reported, he feared that he would suffocate. And the only way he survived, he said, was doing what he had done in the Western Front through the blast of artillery shells, slowing down your mind, breathing between the blasts of the shells, breathing between the howling gusts of wind. They got to the North Col. Mallory thought he could go a little higher. Bullock was knackered. Wheeler was hors de combat. He comes back down, and one of the most poignant moments of that campaign, Mallory, who had disdained Wheeler, stays up all night to save his life, rubbing his frozen legs with whale oil. So 1922, it should be a piece of cake. Straight beeline across the Pangla, skipping Tingri, getting right to the Rongbuk Valley, a beeline up the East Rongbuk to the base of the North Col. The personnel changes somewhat. John Morris was a sensitive lad. He didn't sign up for war out of patriotic duty, but it was boredom that brought him to the front, and a class structure, as he put it, impossible to deny, that led him against all military logic to be elevated into the rank of an officer. He loved the poetry of Keats, the music of Rachmaninoff. The night before he went to the front, he tried to lose his virginity to a Nottingham prostitute. He fled her chambers without even having dropped his trousers, but nevertheless went to a doctor the following day, certain that he had contracted some foul disease. He could hardly see. His glasses were so thick, but in the trenches that didn't keep him from killing. He survived the war by a statistical miracle, and eventually a pamphlet came his way offering an escape to the Indian army. All he knew about India was that it was not France. So before you knew it, he was a soldier in the Indian army, and not 1 month before he met General Bruce in Darjeeling to begin the 22 expedition, his command was ambushed on the northwest frontier by tribesmen. Most of his men were killed. He escaped, got back to the balustrade, looked out into the setting sun, saw the vultures sweeping over the dead, and suddenly saw a figure coming out of the sunset, stumbling. It was one of his men, and as he came closer, his soldier had been flayed alive, his testicles cut from his body, hanging his sinews, threads from his knees. A month later, He was in the Everest Hotel when this man burst through the door, spouting profanities in fluent Nepali. This, of course, was General Bruce, a mountain of a man, as sensitive as an ox. At Harrow, he had established a record for having been thrashed more times in a shorter period of time than anyone in the history of the school. As a young man, he was so strong with one arm extended he could lift a man up to his shoulders. For casual exercise, he carried his adjutant on his back as he ran up and down the Khyber Pass. He slept with every single wife of every boy in his regiment. He was so ferociously strong that his favorite party trick was to rip a pack of cards in half. At Gallipoli, machine gun fire had nearly severed the legs from his body. He was ordered to return to the countryside of England and, above all, never walk upstairs or up a hill. Instead, he chose to lead the 1922 climb of Mount Everest. And the real story in 1922 was the fact that this really was the strongest team of the three expeditions. By this point, George Finch couldn't be denied. By this point, Howard Somerville's available. Wakefield's there, a man of great experience. And of course, of all people, perhaps the greatest recruit, aside from John Noel, the photographer, was the Teddy Norton, a climber of great integrity and strength and a born and natural leader. It seemed to be a piece of cake. And the plan from the very start in 1922, and of course the great debate in 1922, was oxygen or no oxygen. Was oxygen sporting or not? Well, the men of the Everest Committee back in London, who had never climbed anything higher than their desk, claimed that oxygen was unsporting. But those of a scientific bent, like George Finch, who invented the eider-down coat for this expedition, and Howard Somerville, saw that the use of oxygen was no more ungentlemanly than the seeking out of the best possible pair of boots. But the plan in 1922, mandated by the Everest Committee, was to have Mallory and Somerville assault the mountain without oxygen, and then George Finch and Teddy Morton have a go with oxygen. But then, disastrously, soon after reaching the base of the North Col, Finch suffered a terrible relapse of dysentery. And by the time his stomach troubles had passed, Norton and Mooreshead had moved up the mountain to join Mallory and Somerville, and Colonel Strutt, the 2IC, foolishly and regrettably authorized the four of them to assault the mountain. And at this point, people did not yet understand that on Everest there are no second chances. So Mooreshead, Mallory, Norton, and Somerville attacked the mountain, nearly died. Had it not been for a stunningly heroic arrest by Mallory, all four of them would have been swept off the mountain. They came down suffering terribly. You can see Mooreshead will lose several fingers, Norton the tip of his ear. Even Mallory is suffering frostbite. Only the indomitable Howard Somerville is unscathed. But this created an enormous quandary for Finch. There was no one for him to climb with. Did this deter him? No. He simply recruited to his colors the cousin of General Bruce, the transport officer Geoffrey Bruce, slapped an oxygen apparatus on his back, lent him a down coat, and off they went. And they did the absolute impossible. And again, Mallory denied the achievements of one of his fellow climbers. He claimed that Finch had better weather, better food. The truth is, Mallory, without oxygen, set a world record that was then broken but days later by Finch, who in fact endured 2 nights of bivouac, ferocious storms where the wind reminded him of machine gun fire at the front, completely out of water, completely out of food, and still they pressed on. He realized that they could relieve themselves by actually breathing oxygen at night as they slept. At this point, people didn't even know what would happen if the supply of oxygen suddenly ran out, as it did indeed when Geoffrey Bruce suddenly couldn't breathe and almost fell off the mountain, and Finch saved his life. And even as he saved his life, he whipped out the glass to fix the apparatus that had failed. And we know for an absolute fact that Finch got higher on the mountain, closer to the mountain, and climbed the mountain at a rate of ascent 3 times that of Mallory, proving the essential importance of oxygen. And indeed, if George Finch had not taken the time to protect Geoffrey Bruce, had he had but one extra day and not had to spend that extra day in bivouac, it's quite possible that George Finch in 1922 would have reached the top of the mountain. But what did happen in 22 was a divide opened between those back in London and those who had experienced the mountain and realized that the mountain demanded a level of commitment, even at the point of obliteration, that completely defied the notion of a gentleman climber from Oxford or Cambridge. As Finch argued at the end of 22, the margin of safety must be narrowed down, if necessary, to the vanishing point. A climber on Everest must drive himself beyond exhaustion, even to destruction, if need be. Well, Mallory was not a man to be bested by anyone, and so even as Moorshead was evacuated by Longstaff, and Wakefield then, in the place of Longstaff, authorized General Bruce to approve a third effort in 1922. Finch tried to join Mallory on this, was physically incapable, left with Moorshead and Longstaff, and Mallory set off with the goal to climb the hill. And of course, not an hour after this photograph was taken, he heard a crack and the entire side of the north coast swept away and swept 7 Sherpa to the death. And so this created a great haunting and daunting memory for the expeditions. Eventually, they were able to return to the mountain in 1924, a very different set of men. You still had Howard Somerville, you still had Teddy Norton, you had a new member, Noe Odell, and of course the great find of the expedition, young Sandy Irvine. And given what happened to Sandy Irvine, there's always been controversy about as to why he was included in this expedition. There's even a prurient notion in the literature that somehow George Mallory had designs on the handsome young boy from Oxford. Well, this is a complete misreading of Mallory's sexuality and of Irvine's libido. Mallory's experimentation with men was simply part of the bohemian culture of Cambridge before the war. John Maynard Keynes, the founder of modern economics at Cambridge, was famously known as the iron copulating machine. When I signed this book advance, it was the biggest book advance in the history of mountaineering, and the British press went nuts about it, and they concluded that the reason a Canadian botanist got all this money is that I'd proved that Mallory had a homosexual affair in Toronto on the 1923 lecture tour. Well, all you had to do is go to the British Library, and it was only a question of what man in England had not tried to bed George Mallory. And he did have only one sexual liaison, and that was with Lytton Strachey's brother, James. But this was just a passing flurry, and by 1924, he was a happily married man with 3 children, and Sandy Irvine was wildly and devilishly heterosexual. In fact, I can't find a single case of a friend of his from Oxford whose mother he did not bed. And what's more, there were the other critique that maybe Sandy Irvine didn't have skill on a mountain. That's not true. Odell had tested him in the Lake District at Spitsbergen, and of course he was ferociously strong. He was an Oxford Blue as a rower, and strength on Everest, as all of you know, counts for more than technical prowess with the rope. And he was also a mechanical savant. He was probably profoundly dyslexic, but even as a young boy he had submitted a design to the War Office with a gyroscopic gear that allowed a machine gun to be fired through a propeller. The War Office couldn't believe that this came from a teenager. And so he's a perfect addition to the climb because he could take over Finch's role looking after the oxygen apparatus. Now, it wasn't, why did the men love Sandy so much? It wasn't that he embodied why they had fought and so many of their friends had died. Sandy wasn't untouched by the war. His cousin Edward was killed in France, and his own brother was splattered with mustard gas, creating Syrian wounds that would never heal and have to be changed every day until he died in 1965. But Odell and Norton had both lost brothers at the front. All of them had lost friends, and in his exuberance and his optimism, Sandy represented the very reason that all of them had fought and the future for which so many had died. And so famously, Odell, on the last climb, here's Sandy with the oxygen apparatus. Here's Sandy and George at the Pangla looking out toward Everest. In 1924, they were completely bombarded by unexpected snow. They thought the monsoon had arrived early. In fact, we now know that an unusual and a historical low-pressure system had formed that year over the entire Himalaya, and in doing so had brought huge accumulations of snow all up and down the glaciers of Everest. They were at the base of Everest at Camp 3, and a full month before they even were able to establish a camp on the North Col. Men died. They retreated twice back down off the mountain to seek the blessing of the Lama at Rongbuk. In doing so, Norton had inadvertently anticipated what all mountaineers to do today for acclimatization: go up, come down, go up, come down, go up. And eventually then they assaulted the mountain. And Mallory's first effort fell apart. He quickly retreated. The penultimate attack, of course, legendary attack of Norton and Somerville, where Norton reaches the couloir that bears his name, forgets to wear his sunglasses, suddenly experiences vertigo, snow blindness. Howard Somerville leads him off the mountain, but then Somerville himself can no longer breathe, and he begins to punch himself, and eventually he coughs up the entire lining of his throat like a woman giving birth to a placenta. He left his blood on the side of Everest. And then, of course, by nightfall, Norton is blind in great agony, even as George Mallory contemplates the final and fateful assault that would leave that camp on the North Col on June 6th, and famously on June 8th, Odell would declare them, they would disappear on June 8th from their highest camp, and 2 or 3 days later, Norton himself, with Odell's signal, would recognize that both men were lost. Now, the interesting thing is that in the wake of the disappearance of George Mallory, it's fascinating how the men reacted. Norton wrote on June 16th, "We are a sad little party, but from the first we accepted the loss of our comrades in that rational spirit which all our generation had learned in the Great War, and there was never any tendency to a morbid harping on the irrevocable. And so, as constantly in the war, so here in our mimic campaign, death had taken his toll from the very best. Noel Odell, who performed heroic acts of rescue, going up and down the mountain, spending days above 23,000 feet. Once he actually knew that Mallory was gone, his journal entries said not a word about it. He speaks of the weather, the flowers, the wind, the food. The last night as the expedition leaves Rongbuk for the last time, one of them looked out his tent on a night of a full moon and spoke for all when he said, 'I could see the whole of the historic ground, the scene of the protracted adventure, spread out like a map and bathed in soft full moonlight. That night, and with that scene in front of one, it was quite easy to realize that the price of life is death, and that so long the payment be made promptly, it matters little to the individual when the payment is made. Somewhere up there in that vast wilderness of ice and rock were two still forms. Yesterday, with all the vigor and will of perfect manhood, they were playing a great game, their life's desire. Today it is over, and they had gone,' there's a key line, 'without their ever knowing the beginnings of decay. Could any man desire a better end?' So the question on everybody's mind is, did Mallory and Irving get to the top before they succumbed? Well, we have in the audience a wonderful writer and a good friend of mine, David Roberts, who wrote with Conrad Anker probably one of the best books that came out in the immediate wake of the discovery of Mallory's body. And if you read that book, as I did, I think the argument that Conrad makes is pretty decisive, that it's quite unlikely that Mallory and Irving could have gone to the top. The reservations are several. First, there's the matter of clothing. They did not have crampons. When Conrad and Dave Hahn replicated that attack, they found crampons to be essential. Dave Hahn and Conrad left at 2 a.m, didn't get back till 9 p.m. Mallory's flashlight was still in his tent, suggesting the possibility and the likelihood they left at dawn. We know also that they had no stoves. They were profoundly dehydrated as they began that assault. Their ropes were neither strong enough or long enough to rappel down the second step, as modern climbers do. The condition of the men just suggests that it's highly unlikely that they could have climbed the steep face of the second step, exposed as it is 10,000 feet to the Kanchung face on one side and the Rongbuk Valley on the other side. And we probably know for a fact they got to the first step. I suspect somewhere toward the base of the second step, they turned around and came back. But as David and Conrad in their book suggest, there's still this one tantalizing possibility. Had the snow that battered the North Col that fateful year and forced Norton not once but 3 times to retreat, had that snow accumulated in the northeast ridge, as it indeed did in the fall of 1985, it's not inconceivable that an incline of snow could have formed that would have essentially eliminated the impediment of the second step, allowing Mallory and Irvin to advance up that slope with the very speed that Odell so famously reported. And had that happened, and had they been able to get to the top of the second step, surely nothing would have kept Mallory from the summit of Everest. He would have walked on, I think, even to his end, because as was reported by a young soldier from the Western Front, writing to his father, trying to explain the world they lived through, he said, "Father, out here death is but a frail barrier that men cross smiling and gallant every day." All of these climbers had seen so much of death that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. Had Mallory and Irvin been able to get to the top of the second step, you know they reached the top of Everest. Thank you very much.